Hi, I'm Andy Wible, and welcome to Timely Topics. Today we are going to be talking to Barbara Lee, an author, about her new book, Sacred Sex. Welcome, Barbara.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write this book.
Okay. Well, I was in ministry for several years, and in the course of doing that ministry, I had a lot of conversations with people, particularly young people, around things like sexuality. That became a real important focus for me. As you know, for a while, I even did a campus ministry here at MCC and at Baker College, and those were always really important conversations. I personally had an experience too, as far too many young women do in our society, of being sexually abused as a child, and found as I was working with people how common that experience was and how damaging that was to a healthy sex life. And so I had the book kind of ruminating for a long time, and just was in a place where it felt like it was time to get the conversation going. I did the TEDx presentation in November here in Muskegon, and wanted to have something to follow that up with, so I finally committed to writing the book.
Oh, so the book came after your talk.
It was actually, it was published the same day.
Oh, really? Okay, right there together. Oh. So tell us a little bit about the book in terms of, why is it called Sacred Sex?
It's Sacred Sex, and the byline is replacing the marriage ethic with the sexual ethic. The idea behind that, well, there's two kind of broad scopes. One is that society is largely polarized right now between the idea that sex is sin and sex is sport. And sacred sex is about finding that middle ground where we celebrate our sexuality and treat it with moral integrity. The marriage ethic, the problem with that, and the reason it needs to be replaced, is that it basically says that if you're married, sex is okay, and if you're not married, sex is wrong. And that kind of ethic has nothing to say to our young people who aren't married. It has nothing to say to gay and lesbian people who aren't even allowed to get married in our state. It has nothing to say to the single disabled, the single elderly, the widowed, the divorced. Really has nothing to say to anybody who's not married. And at the same time, it implicitly condones a whole host of abusive and demeaning behavior as long as they take place within legally recognized union.
Yeah, I know. I've had people say, so what's the gay ethic when it comes to sex? And sometimes the answer is, I don't know. I guess there isn't one. When you have marriage, there's a lot of custom that's a part of that, or even between men and women, like the man pays for the check or something, and there's the first move's made by the man, But in same-sex relations, it's not all worked out, and so I think sometimes the reason I kind of like the tone of your book is people say, well, there are no rules. But maybe we don't want that either. Right.
And that's where I think it's important that we are crafting a sexual ethic, which takes seriously our needs, our desires, the pains of our bodies, and requires intentionality and discernment about how we will be sexual beings in the world. What are those requirements that have to be in place before I'll engage in sexual behavior?
So it's more of an equality, where I guess marriage ethic doesn't have equality. Is that part of the problem?
Well, part of the problem is that marriage the marriage ethic can imply a lack of equality. And as I said, as long as you're married, it's okay. And that isn't necessarily the case. One of the key components to a sexual ethic that I think is just mandatory is that there be mutual consent, for instance. And that includes with a spouse within a marriage, that every single time you have sex, there has to be mutual consent between both people. Yes means yes, and no means no, and maybe means maybe. And it's not going to be met with coercion or pressure.
So it's not, if you're married to me, it's an implicit or automatic yes.
Correct.
Okay, right. So I guess one thing, someone who's say already married 20 years, I mean, how if you say want to replace a marriage ethic with a sexual ethic, how would that relationship change? for the married couple?
Well, certainly some people are in marriages where they're already exercising a sexual ethic.
Okay, so you can have both kinds.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the aspects of a sexual ethic is to have some degree of relational intimacy. Now, for some people, they might believe that they will only have sex if they're married. There's nothing wrong with making that decision.
Okay.
But to exclude anybody who's not married is just not realistic.
It doesn't seem anything immoral about having sex outside of marriage. Would you agree with that? That's not. I mean, it's something that religions and others have condoned, but
condemned, rather.
Condemned. I said condoned, didn't I? Ooh. I'm sorry. I have not condemned, or have condemned. But is there anything wrong with sex outside of marriage?
Well, there's something wrong with sex outside of marriage that doesn't entail a sexual ethic.
All right, so
so if it's abusive, if the power ratio is unequal and somebody's taking advantage of somebody else, if there's not mutual consent, those are all violations of individuals.
Right. Yeah.
But the need to have a legal recognition of a relationship is kind of our own fabrication, and I believe that we are sexual beings, and whether
So
we're married or
important.
not, that's part of our being, and so we need to be, again, wise and discerning about how we will be sexual in the world.
Okay. You do say sacred sex. What's the sacred part? I mean, why is sex sacred?
The sacred part is about recognizing that the body and the spirit are one. And when we separate body from spirit, we do damage to the whole being. And we see that happening in two different ways. One is through kind of religious teachings that are shame-based around sexuality, that would imply that the spiritual pursuits are good, but bodily pursuits are somehow bad and dirty. And those really hurt people. It leaves people feeling less than whole, and that they can't pursue a healthy sexual life. On the other end of that spectrum, we have the abuse of people through the sex trade industry, where again we're making that severance between a body and a spirit, and now objectifying people and again, causing great damage to individuals.
Okay. Well, let's talk about each of those. First, the bodily part that you mentioned, and that anything involving the body is kind of bad and awful. Even we think of some religious groups, such as the Catholics, and have priests that are celibate. Do you think that's a good idea to have a portion saying, hey, we're excluding sex from our lives?
I don't think that that's a great idea. But again, I think there are individuals who choose a life of celibacy. And if that's somebody's choice, then certainly I honor and respect that choice.
Okay.
I don't think that should be forced upon anybody. It really needs to come out of their own individual journey.
Right.
If they want to make that commitment. And I do think that, those kind of, that tenet about abstinence wasn't always within the church. I mean, that evolved from man-made rules that ended up mostly being about property and making sure that property stayed within the church. And we do see St. Augustine, was the person who came up with original sin. An individual who struggled with his own sexual urges and desires, decided that because that was the case, it must just be totally uncontrollable, and everybody must have that problem, and that's where the idea of original sin came. At the same time, we have a book called Song of Songs in the Bible that is a beautiful testament to a sexual relationship between two non-married people, and the celebration of the bodies and that whole physical aspect of our life.
Right. And I guess something that can be celebrated also can be, people I think often just feel bad when they have sex because it's just this guilt factor that's in their head. And that can't be healthy, can it? No, it can't. And that is, again, I think, why we have to have these conversations. And one of the tenets of a sexual ethic is that sex is not
supposed to be filled with guilt or remorse. It's supposed to be a life-giving celebration.
Yeah, I mean, some see sex as a necessary evil in order to procreate.
Yes.
And that
And again, I think those attitudes are passed on out of fear.
Right.
I think well-intended parents, teachers, religious leaders pass on those messages. And I don't think that the intent is bad, but I think the end result is bad. My personal experience was having been raised to believe that you could only have sex if you were married. And but because of my abuse, I felt like nobody would be interested in me if I didn't have sex. So I was in this horrible catch-22.
Right.
And the end result for me was feeling so overwhelmed with guilt that I ended up getting married at 18 years old.
Wow.
And in a real destructive relationship. And then repeated the pattern. So
these ideas on sex not only can impede your sex life, but also your relationships that surround that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
How about another bodily thing that probably some people worry about is like masturbation. No one else is involved, but a lot of times we're told that's a bad thing. That's something you shouldn't be doing. What would a sexual ethic say about behavior like that?
Yeah, a sexual ethic would not have any problem with that. Nobody is being abused. Nobody is being exploited. It's just a personal experience and a joyous experience, and there's no reason not to celebrate that. One of the places that I feel that's teaching is so damaging is with the disability community. We have people who are living in adult foster care homes and other facilities, and in some of those facilities things are improving greatly, but there are still some places where when a client, a patient, is found masturbating, that they are corrected and shamed and told that they are not to do that. And that's just a horrible...
Even if it's in their own room.
And we're talking about someone who's probably never going to have the experience of a relationship with another person.
Right.
And to not recognize that as a bona fide human need,
Sure.
I just think is inexcusable.
Yeah, in fact, I don't know if encouraging it, but at least allowing for it to happen.
Absolutely.
In appropriate places and so forth. Okay, well, let's talk about the other end that you talked about before, which is more the relationship end, and making sure that the sex that you have with others is not exploitive. I guess a lot of people would think that they've never exploited anyone in sex, but maybe perhaps they have, or they haven't thought that they've been exploited, but they have been. I mean, what are some telling signs that you might want to help people to think about in that area?
Well, one is that you're very clear about the mutual consent, as I talked about, and that there can't be pressure or coercion if the answer isn't yes right away. There's also things like checking to make sure that the power between two people is equal. If it's not, there's just a really great or increased chance that somebody's going to be taken advantage of. People need to take equal responsibility for preventing unwanted pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases. So all of those things have to come on board. And then enough relational intimacy that you can have a conversation like this and make sure that we're on the same page and expecting the same things.
Right.
Because there might not be an intent for a long-term relationship, and if that's fine between the two individuals, as long as they've communicated what the intention is and they're in agreement, that's fine.
So, according to a sexual ethic, at least as you understand it, would sex between two people, as long as it's free and informed and consensual and all that, it need not be done out of love? Or is love a necessary requirement of sex?
Well, I think relational intimacy is a requirement, and again, the ability to have the conversation about what that relationship is. But if there's agreement, then I don't think there's a problem with having a sexual relationship. Now, I do think if when you experience sex, you also have to recognize that there are emotional consequences to that, and I think a lot of our young people don't realize all of the emotional consequences that can follow. And so I think it is important to, there is a degree of caring that has to go into wanting to have your partner be safe, and that kind of mutual respect has to be there.
Right, and I guess, I worry maybe sometimes people say yes and they consent, but, and you kind of mentioned this, they don't feel like they can say no. And so is it really consensual if the person doesn't really feel like he or she, often she, can't say no?
No, that's not consent.
So how do you make sure that a person's strong enough or doesn't feel threatened enough to say no?
Well, part of it is by creating opportunities for people to have these conversations and to be empowered to know that they have the right to make choices about their body.
Yeah. Here's what someone might say. No. This would be, if I had this conversation, it would be a real buzzkill. I'd ruin the whole idea of having sex if I have to have this conversation. How do you respond?
I think that's absolutely inaccurate.
Okay.
And
that might even spur it on.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's an excuse for not having the conversation.
Okay. Right.
And as soon as you do that, as soon as you take away the communication, then you're not working in a sexual ethic.
Okay.
And I do think one of the other great risks right now, especially for our young people, is the amount of internet pornography. The average age of exposure to internet pornography is 10 years old now.
That's pretty young.
It's very young. And unfortunately, much of what's available isn't even a real accurate picture of what sex is and what real people do or what they really enjoy. And there's a lot of distortion, a lot of distorted ideas, and just a trivialization that sex is nothing special anymore.
And often the relationships in pornography are not equals.
Oh, no, not at all.
People like power and they want to see that in their pornography, I guess.
Yeah, and I think more so the pornography is getting more and more violent and degrading. When I was in high school, the walk that we females had to make was trying not to fall into the camp of being labeled a prude or a slut. And my 18-year-old son, I was talking about this too recently, and he said, "Geez, Mom, I don't know a single girl who's not a slut." I don't think that's even true, but I do believe that's the image that many of our young ladies think they need to project these days.
In order to be attractive or be thought to be.
Well, and I think there's just so many complicated and contradictory messages right now that we've got to have these conversations.
Sure. Could though, I know I've heard in the past, and I don't think there's so many anymore, but maybe I don't know, that married men would go to a brothel and have sex with a prostitute. Is that allowable in a sexual ethic? I mean, in one way, it's consent on both sides. One person pays to have sex with the other one freely takes the money to have sex with that person. Is that a healthy type of sex?
I think there's two problems with that. One is that when there's money exchange, there's an unequal relationship. That takes the equality out of the relationship. The other problem is that maybe the relationship is consensual between the two. Is it also consensual between the other partner? Is the nature of the relationship that the man is in one of monogamy and commitment? If it's not, then there's not a violation there. But if that's supposed to be a monogamous relationship, then he's violating a sexual ethic by going outside of that.
Right. Yeah. Now, what about someone who says, "Well, I've never technically done prostitution, but sometimes I've felt like it. Either because I've accepted or paid for a dinner, and I thought, well, there's some expectation with that.
Well, again, I would say that moves us into that question of mutual consent. And if I'm saying yes because I feel obliged to, then that's not the same as giving consent.
Sure. What role do you think sexual education in schools plays towards our understanding of sex? Is that an important part of the way people feel and think about sex?
I think it's extremely important that we have that kind of conversation and education in our schools, and certainly, age appropriate as our kids grow. But again, they are being inundated with information, and we
from home, the internet, and at school.
And television, and society is bombarding them. And the only hope that we can have of having any impact in their sexual decision making is by having these kind of conversations and the necessary education. Right now, the health studies where they survey the high schools showed that only, in 7th grade, I believe only 50% of the kids had ever talked to a parent or another adult about sex.
Yeah.
And by 11th grade, there were still like 30% who'd never had that conversation. And at the same time, they're engaged in sexual activity. The other thing that's happening with a lot of our youth is they believe that they can maintain a vow of abstinence by only participating in oral sex or anal sex. And as a result, we also have a big influx of STDs that are showing up.
Well, I think Muskegon County is second among youth in STD rates.
It's very high.
In the state of Michigan. Yeah, we're right behind Detroit. That's not a good thing.
It's not.
And even though a lot of these gonorrhea, chlamydia are treatable, often those lead to things like HIV that are not are treatable but not curable like those others are.
Correct.
That is a huge concern. And we do have, I think, laws that are very restrictive in Michigan that say you can only talk about abstinence.
That's not exactly true. The laws in Michigan, what Michigan says is that you have to provide education on HIV and AIDS. That's the only education that's mandatory.
Okay.
And then it's basically up to the school systems to decide what to do from there. So it really varies. And in a school such as Grand Haven, they only do the mandatory HIV/AIDS education.
That's it.
Nothing more. In Muskegon, I recently met with an educator, and they're actually starting sex education in 5th grade and recognizing that even as early as 9 years old, kids are starting to gender select. And so they're being very intentional about including conversation about sexual orientation and gender identity at appropriate levels too as kids grow.
Well, maybe I was wrong. Well, thanks for correcting me on that. But it is worrisome, though. I remember when I was a kid, the guy came in and said, "You want to stop an STD?" And this was a local physician they brought in. He said, "Here's the only way." And he put down this little statue of a penis in a knot, and he said, "Not having sex is how you do it. That's the only way."
And there are a number of abstinence-only teachings or schools that only do abstinence teaching, and I think that's very problematic. And as a result, we have. I could tell you about the 13-year-old who just got pregnant, and her parents said she'd raise the kid as her punishment for having sex. She did have a miscarriage a couple of weeks later, which is probably a good thing. We have an increase in abortions because we have 15 and 16-year-olds who don't dare tell their parents they've had sex. That the abstinence-only education does, I think, enforce that atmosphere of shame and just takes away the opportunity for conversation.
Right. And as you said, it doesn't need to be that way. Evidently, the law doesn't require it, and we can do better.
Yeah.
Interesting. So how about this? Let's go the other way. Let's say someone is, kind of talked about this a bit, but someone might say, yeah, I don't know if I want to read this. You know, I've been married for 25 years and it's too late to change anything. What would you say to that person?
I would say that it's always a good time to look at what your practices have been and whether they are appropriate. And it's not just, again, it's about you, but it's also about your partner. If you've been married for 25 years, it might be time to make sure that your partner is also feeling that everything is okay. The other thing is, if you've been married 25 years, there's a good likelihood you have children or grandchildren, and these are important conversations to have with your kids. It's a great, the book is really laid out in concise short chapters for individual reflection and group conversation.
Okay.
Great book to hand to a kid and say, why don't you read this and then we'll talk, that icebreaker.
Oh, okay.
Because so many parents don't know how to begin the conversation. So it's a really good tool for that as well.
Do you think, I forget the names of some of these, but there used to be some shows like Dr. Ruth Westheimer talking about sex. Dr. Drew had a show, a call-in show with talking about sexual questions. Do you think those are good for people to watch and engage in as a way to talk about sex?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I talk in the book about when I was growing up, it was Dr. Phil Donahue. It wasn't Dr. Phil, it was just Phil Donahue. Who introduced me to all kinds of people and ideas in just non-judgmental ways, and allowed me to learn and grow. Sure. And we need to provide those opportunities.
Yeah. Well, I think you're starting to do that, and your book is making some inroads into that. So thanks for sharing it.
I hope so.
And how do people get that book if they'd like to?
Well, the easiest way is probably to go to my website, which is barbaraleeauthor.com. Okay. And they can actually see the TEDx presentation. They can order the book. They can go right to the Amazon link and order it through Amazon. Okay. It's at amazon.com. It is available on Kindle and on Nook, and it's at the Bookman in Grand Haven. It's also at 5 of the Muskegon County libraries, the Spring Lake Library and the Grand Haven Library.
So you could check it out for free or buy it. And I think it's pretty reasonably priced, isn't it?
$9.
Wow.
It's a deal.
Yeah, can't beat that. Well, thank you again for being with us, Barbara.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you all for watching Timely Topics. It's been a pleasure to have you. We've been talking to Barbara Lee, author of Sacred Sex, and having a nice open discussion about sex in our lives, something very important. So until next time, have a great day.